Yes, so we have talked a lot about different use cases, and I'm sure you are so inspired with the amount of different use cases and the newer and innovative uses of AI that are actually being implemented in the medtech space and the healthcare delivery space, and coming from the technology leaders as well. And as we were, developing the concept for this conference, one of the conversations I had is with a colleague that I really respect at Mayo Clinic, John Poe, who is the chair of the education in Mayo Clinic. And one of the things he said at the very beginning really stayed with me, and he was like, okay, like AI is like anything, it brings risk, right? And we're doing it for the patient. So the patient is at the center. So how can we do AI and take on the risk, which we cannot avoid, but remove the patient from the risk as much as we can? So that brings us to some of the regulatory conversations as how we bring AI into a marketplace on the first place. So in this session, we're going to be talking about the regulatory guardrails and how they are going to be evolving or not in the pace of AI, and how can we ensure more AI coming this way. So I have an amazing panel, and I will do very quick introductions first, and then I will ask each speaker to say a little bit more about themselves. So joining us from DC, right, is Dr. Haider Warraich. So he wanted to be here, but there were some travel restrictions, but we made it happen anyways. And I even sent him a little note. I said, the moment the travel restrictions come, do the crazy thing, hop on a plane if you can. But Dr. Haider Warraich is a cardiologist, and he's working at the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, or ARPA-H for short. He is a program manager in the Scalable Solutions Office. And prior to that, Dr. Warraich served at the US FDA as a senior clinical advisor for chronic disease to the FDA commissioner, where he helped shape policy around drugs, devices, nutrition, digital health, and artificial intelligence. Hi, and welcome, Haider. And then we have Marielle Lejcher, correct? Yes, who is an accomplished quality and regulatory leader with more than 20 years of experience. She's the president of ZoaDx, an animal health clinical research organization focused on advancing animal health to protect human health. And also she serves as the senior director of regulatory affairs and quality at CovarsaDx, another clinical research organization. And we have Dr. Genevieve Melton-Meaux, who's a professor of surgery and health informatics here at the University of Minnesota. She's also the Senior Associate Dean of Health Informatics and Data Science and Director for the Center for Learning Health Systems and Sciences at the University of Minnesota. And Dr. Melton-Meaux also serves as the Chief Health Informatics and AI Officer for mHealth Fairview leading informatics. So again, yet another panel where you see presenters coming from the more regulatory side and innovation side, from regulatory in the medtech space and the health system space. So the one thing that I know you may be all wondering, I said all these titles, and when I meet speakers, the first thing I kind of wonder is, what is their day-to-day life like? And if maybe each speaker, we could start with describing us sort of your day-to-day role in job and responsibilities, and maybe some of the things that keeps you really excited. And Haider, can we start with you?
Absolutely. I'm sorry I couldn't be here. I love being in Minneapolis, and so hopefully we can make this work at a later stage. But thank you for the invitation. Just to recap, my name is Haider. I'm a cardiologist. I'm currently at ARPA-H. Before that, I was at FDA, did a lot of work at FDA, including leading our special communication on AI, and did a lot of work on the generative AI space too. I'll tell you everyone a little bit about ARPA-H, because not everyone knows about ARPA-H. But ARPA-H is a relatively new federal agency that was formed about 2 years ago. And the idea for ARPA-H was really to develop a DARPA, but for healthcare. So essentially an agency that supports high risk, high reward research programs in healthcare. So to give you an example of the sort of stuff that we are supporting, so we don't do any research ourselves. But we reach out to the community and solicit really the best of breed from a technology perspective teams. The sort of work that we have supported includes like crazy things like transplanting eyes or reversing osteoarthritis. And the program that I'm developing is really focused on whether we can develop AI agents that can provide clinical care directly to patients. And certainly there's a huge, I came here with a real sort of regulatory background, coming from FDA. This is obviously uncharted territory with regards to regulation, both here and around the world. But there's a lot of potential here. And so the question, so my day-to-day right now is to make sure that the solicitation that we develop, that, which is basically, the way I describe it is that, we are creating a recipe, and then we invite all the best chefs in the world to tell us how they would make that recipe. We pick the ones that we think are closest to our own vision for what that would look like. One of the big differences in what ARPA-H does and what others do is that we're really milestone based. So instead of saying, here's 5 years worth of money, I'll see you at the end, hopefully you'll write a new paper. Our goal is really much more hands-on. So we're checking in with our teams very regularly, and we're also really focused on developing products and about the commercial impact and potential of the ideas that we support. So my day-to-day is really talking to a lot of experts, making sure that are we focused on the right problems? Are there people who have already solved the problem so we don't have to? And who could be the best possible folks who we could support in the future? But really delighted to be here and to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Marielle?
Sure. Thank you, Pinar. Pleasure to be here today. Thank you. So my name, as Pinar mentioned, is Marielle Lejcher, and I currently work at 2 clinical research organizations. They are owned by the same person and their sister CROs. And so the first one is CovarsaDx, where I lead regulatory affairs and quality. I joined last summer and then recently was appointed president of our sister CRO, which focuses on animal health, because as we can see right now with the avian influenza outbreak in particular, animal health, veterinary medicine is very closely linked with human health and protecting our food supply. And so I provide strategic regulatory advisory to our sponsors and clients and also my colleagues for clinical trials. We focus mainly on IVDs and medical devices. So for those of you that aren't familiar with IVDs, those are in vitro diagnostics or laboratory diagnostics, your lab testing. And we provide, clinical research and strategic regulatory. So we help our clients figure out their path to market. How do they get their product through the FDA? I also, am familiar with European and Southeast Asian regulatory strategy, but we mainly focus at our CRO on US FDA. And so what does that path look like throughout the clinical trial process? How do we design the clinical trial to have the best regulatory outcome? And then to strategically have those discussions with the agency to bring these products to market. And so that's true for both the veterinary space and the human health space. And I'm happy to be here today, talking a little bit more about software as a medical device and AI-enabled devices.
Thank you. Thank you. Genevieve?
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Genevieve Melton-Meaux. I'm a surgeon and data scientist by training. I affectionately say I'm on my 4th or 5th avatar. Because it's a circuitous path that I've been through. So I started as a data scientist, practicing surgeon, and then about 12 years ago, I realized as an informatician that really what was important to me anyway was to be able to do things directly in healthcare. So I became a CMIO, and I did have the background in data, so over time became a chief analytics officer, and really have spent most of my time in operations In the middle of COVID, I had the opportunity to really start to bring some research along with clinical operations together, and then had the opportunity to do work to form something called the Center for Learning Health System Scientists. So the center really focuses on late-stage translation that's really supposed to be practical and fit for operations. So that's really the focus. There's a lot of AI innovation, new technologies, IT, but some of it's quality improvement, patient-centric related stuff, because we don't often innovate in a way that we know whether or not it really worked. And so we try to bring the best of research and the best of operations together, and I say we're creating a different animal. Yeah.
Well, thank you. So I guess to kind of get us started in thinking about regulation of AI, I think that the first question is, the audience may be more familiar with the regulation of the medical devices or, pharmaceuticals, and maybe Haider, because you recently served in the FDA as a senior advisor, maybe could you walk us through sort of FDA's journey in regulating AI-enabled products a little bit? Like, what is FDA's general approach? And then we can all together kind of go deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds great. And, I think that we have a great panel, so I think that it'll be great to get those additional perspectives. So, FDA has been focused on, or has been sort of working through the AI space through its different sort of variations over, at least since the mid-90s, when FDA approved the first sort of AI-enabled medical device. And the way that I think FDA has approached this space is really similar or an extension of the work that they've done in the software as medical device space. And it still retains a very sort of risk-based approach to these technologies. There are a couple of different pathways that folks can take based on how novel their device is. If there's a device or if it's an AI algorithm that is a derivative or similar to a prior AI algorithm that has been previously approved, that pathway, which is 510(k) pathways, looks very different, and it's much more approachable than if you're developing a novel product. The other thing that, so over time, FDA has actually been quite active in this space. FDA likes to tout that they have authorized almost 1,000 AI-enabled medical devices. I think that comes with some caveats. I think one caveat is that the majority of those devices fall into the 510(k) pathway, which provides much more, which is a much more less onerous and favorable pathway in general for developers. The other thing that's missing there is that FDA has yet to regulate or authorize any generative AI technology. FDA, and because of that, FDA hasn't really shared any formal guidance or even draft guidance that can guide the development and evaluation of generative AI technologies. So there's a real gap that is there. Having said that, there are many other AI technologies that are being used that don't meet FDA's criteria for a medical device. And really, so many of these tools end up being clinical decision support tools that are meant to augment physician decision making. I will say that many of these tools kind of fall in a gray area where it really depends on how much, how hard does FDA want to use their definition? Because even something as simple as a medical scribe, for example, can potentially hallucinate. But not only that, it can add new diagnoses or conditions that were never discussed during a patient's visit. And so I think in general, FDA is practicing a lot of enforcement discretion, which is to say they want to stay out of the way for innovators to develop these technologies. But that's kind of where FDA is right now. And how they evolve as they move forward is, I think it's up in the air as a new leadership looks at this space as they are doing, and will take a really critical perspective on, how might FDA want to evolve their practice and their approach in the AI space going forward?
Great. So looking forward as well, Marielle and Genevieve work with a lot of, in the health system with the clinicians and patients, and you're working with a lot of clients and organizations. So, and you're observing in real world the advancements in AI, and it's rapid. So from your perspectives, what are some of the most significant risks associated with AI, given the rapid advancements in AI? And when you try to think from the regulatory side, like, does the regulatory mechanism allow for addressing some of these?
Sure, I'll go. So like you just mentioned, the rapid pace of innovation is really outpacing like digital health policy, both in the U.S. and globally, right? So there really isn't a great infrastructure for us yet to follow. There's no guidance documents. FDA's kind of published their sort of opinion on it, but there's no guidance. So what I would say is, when we advise our clients, first we have to decide, is it a device, right? So when we talk about all these AI-enabled tools, a lot of them are related to electronic health records. We heard about that today. They're related to these tools that augment. But a device under the FD&C Act, or Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, has to diagnose, cure, treat, mitigate, or prevent. So if it's for monitoring, it's not a device. So it has to actually meet that definition of a device. And next, of course, FDA will use a risk-based approach, like we just heard. And then finally, and this is where I think it's very critical, is what is the intended use of the AI-enabled device and the Gen AI-enabled device? What is the intended use? Because that's where it gets very difficult and challenging. And the scope of that intended use you have to be able to bound the scope of that intended use. And Gen AI-enabled devices are often very broad in their intended use. And when you can't clearly define the intended use, which is kind of like, what is the device for? Who is it used by? What is its purpose? What's the intended use population? Like, what's the population that this device is going to serve? And you can't identify that very clearly, or in the technological characteristics of that device and its purpose, then it becomes very difficult, I think. So that's one of the main risks, is the intended use being very clearly bound. But next, it's the two main things we think about with AI, whether it's gen-enabled or non-gen-enabled AI, is we think about data privacy and security. So first in that kind of umbrella would be sensitivity, right? So, or I should say more like PHI, right? Protected health information, confidential information that might get inadvertently shared through these AI tools. But second, and also very critical, would be bias. We've heard a lot about bias today from a lot of our other speakers. And the bias is not necessarily intentional, but based on the foundational model of the AI, you can introduce bias. And that's just based on the training data. And I want to point out one very clear distinction, I think, for the purposes of FDA consideration would be, we have AI-enabled devices. And those that are non-generative, right, are more looking at patterns of data, learning patterns of data. But when we talk about generative AI, we are creating new data. And that creation of new data is based on training data. And that's where you can really, that's where the risk is. And that's where the intended use is really hard to define, is you're creating this data that's not necessarily predictive, right? And you're introducing bias. And so by doing that, you are likely introducing new risks. And that's where it's really hard to talk about like 510K and predicate devices, and you're more in this like breakthrough device category. And I want to make sure you have an opportunity to touch on that as well. But from a regulatory standpoint, those are probably the greatest challenges that we think of.
I think the other two speakers covered it well as far as this tension, right? Regulation, the way we do our work from a legislative perspective is incredibly slow. And in many cases, we're delegating, say, to the FDA, which is a little bit quicker. But the innovation is going so much quicker. And I think the model that we have around devices, drugs, is somewhat analogous. I feel like we just have much more that we need to evolve to. So as was covered, a lot of this has been modeled after software as a medical device. Some of the pieces, when you look at performance metrics, this idea of transparency can't be underlined enough for that frontline clinician. When I'm sitting there advising a patient, knowing how that solution that I'm using, that AI-enabled solution, works for that particular patient in front of me, because on average it may work very well, but maybe the training data, there's just insufficient data for that patient in front of me. So some of those pieces, even in the regulation and what goes into the information that goes in front of that clinician or even the patient. We haven't even talked about that. In some cases, these are going to be solutions that are in front of the patient. I think the other big thing with post-market surveillance, or even that initial, I'll go back, even for that initial approval process, usually, like with a drug, it's phase 1, 2, 3, and then it goes to market. We have the exact opposite. You have this solution, and in most cases, it's barely been tested in practice. So we don't even go to that extent. And then post-market surveillance, I'll just leave it at that. But the way we monitor and the way we talk about implementation of that solution and all those conditions, like what you were just talking about, that go into using that solution, all those aspects are so important because it's a socio-technical thing in many cases that's going to give the value and make the solution work the way it's supposed to.
Yeah, so there's a lot of role it sounds for from the regulatory, both on the pre-evaluation and the post, as AI evolves. And I know, Rodolphe, you talked about like the locked systems and the solutions for locked systems versus unlocked systems, and is going to be very, very different. Haider, I recently read your JAMA paper, which I really was intrigued with, and there you talk about some flexible regulatory mechanisms, right? Mm-hmm. So when I think about regulation, it's sort of like almost like a recipe, right? A, B, and C, and then D. And so when you say the need for flexible regulatory mechanism, could you elaborate on that?
Sure thing. So I think one clear example of this is relevant to the AI space. So one of the things I was mentioned before is that even for so just to sort of level set, I think there are two sort of big buckets of AI in healthcare that are being looked at. One is generative AI, which is creating new data, and then we have predictive AI, which is which is essentially doing pattern recognition. But so even when you look at predictive AI algorithms, their performance can change over time if they're exposed to different data contexts, if they learn as they go forward, if the patient population changes, if they're introduced to a new healthcare setting. And one of the things and that performance can actually get better, but in some certain instances it can also get worse. It can learn from some of the sort of bad patterns. Bias is one thing that comes up that is present in the underlying data. So in the traditional FDA model, if you made any significant change to your medical device or AI algorithm, you'd have to come back to the FDA, and that would introduce a whole sort of new set of regulatory challenges and delays. And basically to preempt that, FDA issued a guidance called the Predetermined Control Change Plan, or PCCP, guidance document. And the whole idea was that if you can outline what changes you anticipate and how you might be able to, how you might mitigate those, even before they've occurred at the time of your initial submission, that then you didn't have to come back to FDA for when you made that change. So I think that is a sort of reflection of the sort, in the past, FDA has also tried other programs that haven't worked. The pre-cert program is one such program that was launched in the past that was really looking at good manufacturing practices for developers at large, but that program has folded. There are other ongoing programs too, like the Breakthrough Devices program is one more. So I think what is clear is that especially in the in the device space, which is where AI really falls, there has been a clear track record of FDA taking on new innovative approaches. How they go forward in the AI space is really, I think it's fair to say that hasn't been articulated, but I do know that, and I think one of the key messages is really that AI is really a area that the administration is really focused on. There have been several executive orders, including one yesterday, that have really emphasized that point. So I think this is going to be a moving target. But I anticipate that, for all the areas that fall within FDA's purview, I think AI is going to be one where there is going to be more room for flexibility than perhaps in more traditional paths. But I'd love to hear other folks' thoughts on this too.
Yeah, Marielle, especially I wanted to ask you regarding this flexible, and Haider mentioned like this pre-world
Right.
before something comes and you're working with a client. Like, so can you comment a little bit maybe on, is there such a thing like pre-market AI evaluation? Is that possible?
Well, I think and FDA has published an opinion on this too. When we think about software, and generally software as a medical device, software in a medical device, it always follows kind of the software life cycle, right, as part of the total product life cycle. Mm-hmm. And so you're thinking about software planning and development and implementation and validation, and and testing and all these things to make sure that the software is safe and effective for use. And so I think part of the pre-market, which is before you do your regulatory filing, part of that is going to be kind of thinking about the entire product life cycle. How do you test the device? What type of testing is available for this device? Because as Haider pointed out, there's no design lock on generative AI, right? You don't just lock your design and you don't make any changes to it and that's it. The AI adapts with all these conditions and variables. And so that'll be addressed in the post-market side, which you were just talking about as well. But on the pre-market side, there has to be some level of flexibility where we look more at the manufacturer to do some of that testing, use some real-world evidence, and kind of look at the total product life cycle as part of what informs the safety and effectiveness of the product.
Yeah. And Genevieve, how does the health system approach this? Like this life cycle approach, what role can a health system play?
So a couple of things to comment on. The first is this idea of, implementation. And, first is probably starts at selection, and that we spend so much time trying to be very judicious and smart with what we go forward with. But, implementing smartly and trying to pilot before we scale is definitely something that we try to do so that if we're going to fail or have issues, that we fail fast or learn quickly before we, take it more broadly and aren't sure how it's going to work. Certainly for the traditional AI, we, have monitoring that we do. We have almost like what we call, it's an AI oversight group that, is composed of, it's almost like an IRB. It has an ethicist on it. Our chief quality and safety officer is on it, compliance as well as clinicians, IT. So it's got the right stakeholders there, and we put a plan in place on how we're going to take care of that AI and monitor it. But, I think, there's challenges. A larger health system is able to do that, I think, more readily. Like Dr. Rue was talking about, a rural healthcare system, that's going to be much harder to do that. But there's a lot more, I think, to figure out over time. Yeah.
Yeah. So in some break conversations I've had, I've heard maybe some conversations around we want to do the right thing anyways, right? We're a health system, we care for the patient, we want to do the right thing anyways. I guess if any one of you can pick up on this, is there such a thing called self-regulation? Is there a role for self-regulation, and what kind of places can do this and or not?
There's definitely a role for self-regulation. I think somebody, when they asked the question with the previous panel and talked about, decision support, and how do you monitor that? I think, you know, there's a huge role for that. The other part to maybe mention, and our clinical informatics fellows here, Leo, is this idea of stress testing your generative AI in particular, because it's easy when you're in this, you know, and we've been testing agentic AI right now, so interactions between, it would be the patient, it would take the place of a nurse, and these are more routine things like, let's do the colonoscopy prep or do the preoperative phone call, and the responses back and forth. And you're fine when you're in the confined space of the typical questions, but once you go to the edges, that's where it starts to fail. So, you know, some pieces around that are quite important. Yeah.
Other thoughts? Okay, well, so I want to switch gears maybe to a little bit on like the stakeholders that are involved in creating AI and regulating it and implementing it. And, you know, there's a dominance of, you know, commercial AI products by some big tech companies, and that's natural probably because of their access to capital and other resources, computational and other resources. And I think I would like each of our speakers to maybe comment on the emphasis or the priority we need to think about for balancing the stakeholders and thinking about creative ways to encourage, you know, ensure safe and effective AI by, say, startups, entrepreneurs, and maybe Haider, you see this from the ARPA-H perspective, and you see this through different clients you work with, Marielle, and Genevieve, maybe from like an academic institution, like brewing ideas from the academic institution, like what are some ways that you're thinking could be effective? We could start with Haider, maybe.
Sure. So the way that I'm seeing this field right now, it seems like the big tech players are really focused on developing foundational technologies or orchestration frameworks. You know, they're really focused on those B2B types of products. And you know, this is true for both, you know, both for agentic AI, but for generative AI as well. But they're not, but at least from what I've seen, they're really looking to the startups to use those technologies to develop bespoke products that are going to then, you know, go through the regulatory pathway. So in some ways that, you know, because I think it's fair to say that especially generative AI does carry emergent risks, the known unknowns, the unknown unknowns. I think because of that, I think at least in my perspective, I think that the big tech firms are focused more on developing the tools that then can be used by others to build their agents or their generative AI solutions that are then going to be embedded in the healthcare system, integrated, and then walk down the regulatory pathway. That might change in the future. And so in this case, I think that there is a lot of dependency between those two. At least that's what I've seen. I've seen that there is actually a fair degree of symbiosis there. You know, the startups don't have the resources to be able to develop new foundation models, and the startups are also the ones who are going to be positioned to take on some of the risks involved in developing these innovative solutions. So I see, you know, in my perspective, so the way I see it is that I don't see that clear demarcation in this field right now. At least in my interactions, I think that at least on the back end, when I look at the manufacturer side, it seems like there's a lot of good synergy and collaboration going because there's just so much dependency between those two actors. That's at least been my perspective. I'd love to get others too.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll add on to that, Haider. So I think, you know, like we heard earlier, I think Haider said, I mean, there's over 1,000 AI-enabled devices already approved by FDA, and that's the vast majority of what we think of right now in industry is actually not truly generative AI in the context of a device. When we talk about a product that meets the definition of device, like I mentioned earlier, that follows a risk-based approach. But for truly generative AI devices, it has to be a collaborative effort. It will be on a breakthrough device designation pathway through the US FDA. It will be a novel device pathway. And when I say novel device, I mean de novo, so there's nothing else like it in the market, right, that's already being commercialized. And even if there's something similar on the non-gen AI-enabled, kind of in that grouping, the Gen AI aspect of it and the uncertainty that comes with that intended use would likely push it into a de novo category anyway. De novo is for moderate risk devices for which there is no predicate, and of course, pre-market approval or PMA is for the high risk devices. So you're really looking at the de novo or PMA pathway. And in order to bring a generative AI device to market through FDA, there has to be collaboration between industry and between FDA, and a lot of communication and interactive discussions around what does that flexibility look like on the pre-market side, and what will the post-market side look like, and what does that level of responsibility look like? We've talked today about responsible AI, how it's a team effort. I know Sarah touched on that, and it's a team effort between FDA and industry too, because as soon as they approve a Gen AI enabled device, there is the post-market aspect. How do you continue to make sure that these devices remain safe and effective for patients? And as the device is adapting, right, based on all of its conditions, how is how are patients still getting access to those? And of course, there's always the reimbursement piece, but I'm not going to go into that right now. So yeah, go ahead, Genevieve.
So I'm going to take the perspective of healthcare systems today. There's a huge, and you covered this well during the previous presentation. There's a huge money piece today that's going on. It feels, on one hand, it feels like there is really great partnership and collaboration that's going on with big tech as well as startups, et cetera, the whole spectrum. On the other hand, on putting my IT hat on right now, being at a healthcare system, it feels like you're just getting one more bite taken out of you each time because it's so costly, and we've had to really increase our acumen around how much does it cost for every single transaction of data. We've had to do that in our cloud transformation as well. There's a lot that's happening with learning collaboratives, whether it's bringing together, in some cases, regulators, for sure, industry, lots of providers. If we just take, the example of, say, the ambient AI space, or some of the stuff that's been going on in imaging. There was that example before that Dr. Rue had about the eye sort of set of collaboration work. That part has been really, really positive. So we are bringing stakeholders together in a different way, and these solutions have to be powered by data, and that gets all the way back to the patient and the provider side of things. So this interaction and this ecosystem, we're starting to see changes in how some of these barriers and silos that have been traditionally in place. We need solutions, say even around sharing our data and how do we do that safely, effectively, and maintain privacy. But that's sort of the tension. I will tell you, as a front line leader that's trying to really build up an AI program, it's really ROI, value, readiness of the organization. And if there are platforms in place that I can take advantage of, we haven't talked a whole lot about our EHR platform, but we're using it shamelessly and trying to do that really well.
No, ROI was definitely something. I'm glad you touched on that. I wanted to get to. Just for the interest of time, I want to make sure the audience has an opportunity to also ask questions. Do we have questions for our panel?
Dr. Genevieve. I'm Dr. Colgate. We work at mHealth Fairview, and I appreciate all you do. My question for you would be challenges in implementing AI in healthcare, especially for AI scribing. That has been a challenge. I believe we're cautious as providers because EHR has led to burnout, and I just wanted to say or ask how I can convince other clinicians to adapt to that and prevent AI fatigue. My second question is to the panel. We've touched on it, but I don't think I've gotten any credible solutions to unconscious bias and data bias. I just would like to know how AI can close that loop and align or allow for health equity in all populations. I'll give an example of we're doing a physician leadership exercise, and we were told to put in some data into AI, and it was going to produce this picture. And I put in my data very excitedly. I'm like, yes, I'm going to get a good picture to share to the group. Unfortunately, got my race wrong. So not happy about that. The second thing will be something like osteoporosis. So I'm a family physician, and I'm very, very pro preventative measures. Osteoporosis is a diagnosis that we've given to certain risk factor patients when I was in med school 20 years ago. And unfortunately, my mother was diagnosed with that. We're not part of that risk. So I just would like to ask questions on how we can reduce, because that's my anxiety, that's my nightmare. Thank you.
So I'd like to talk about your first question and your last question. I'll start with the last one. It has to be front of mind, and it has to be measured. So if you take that example of some of the race-based bias that is in place, you know, there's the example with, say, creatinine or some of the risk-based measures with osteoporosis and bone scan testing. That has to be part of the design. And so, you know, when we think about the oversight, et cetera, you know, and whether it ends up in a regulatory framework or not, we have to measure it and we have to be looking for it. And then as far as AI scribes, I have a bit of commentary there. You know, there is that technology innovation sort of adoption curve, and you have people that are going to do it right away, and on the other end of things, the laggards. And I can tell you from our experience, and this has been, I think, the experience of many other organizations, you will have people that are on throughout that curve. And so, you know, we've done several pilots. Now we have solutions that if you wish to participate and continue to do so, it's something that you can have in your practice. But what we did find, even with the pilots, and this is with very deliberate engagement with these first sets of providers, we would still have close to a third of providers that did not have great uptake. And why that is, you know, I think we have a lot more to learn about that, but that certainly is an aspect of what's going on. There is, for sure, something about having people around you doing it and it really becoming the standard of care. So I think that is part of the solution as well, and trying to reach people across different forums. So we've had town halls, we have different, like if you want to be part of this engagement group, we have places where you can go, and we're available to answer questions about that. And then in some cases, it just becomes the standard of care. So I think there are some organizations that are starting to go all the way to that end of things. And in addition, using a technology like this or a solution like this well involves like a whole bunch of different things, like teaching that provider maybe to document and think about how they look at their documentation differently at the end. What's the conversation I have with the patient in front of me? I remember, you know, the first couple times I used it in clinic, I had a patient who I said, you know, this is like Alexa. She's like, I don't know what Alexa is, right? So, you know, you just, there, and so having a standard script and a way that we communicate and talk about it, and the organization has to be part of that solution as well. But we're undergoing this digital transformation, and the more we can help everybody on that journey is really important. Providers that use this and use this well say that they do feel a lot better. Yeah.
Haider or Marielle, do you want to comment on the second question of the bias a little bit more? Are there new ways to think about bias and eliminating bias in AI?
Well, I mean, what I'll say about bias is that, you know, when we submit clinical trial data to the FDA or any regulatory authority for review, bias is always one of the greatest challenges, right? In fact, most of the AIN letters that come back, you know, for major deficiencies are often around bias in the patient population. and in the data set. So that's not a new risk by any means. That risk exists for device types outside of AI-enabled devices, but certainly it is a significant ethical consideration and risk in Gen AI-enabled devices. We've touched on that earlier. It's inherent kind of in the data and how the training data, is put into the foundational model. And I'm sure Dr. Ru could talk more about that, but it's basically how the model is built, right? So the output is only going to be as good as the data that goes into it to inform it. So if it's very broad and it's not specific to a particular intended use or population, then you're going to get bias in the output. So I think that's part of the challenge when we look at regulatory risk and how you classify the risk in the device type for AI-enabled devices. But Haider, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that too.
I think one of the key things that you mentioned already is that I think, unfortunately, bias is not an attribute that is specific to AI, although the scalability of AI can certainly, I think that's really where the risk lies. Certainly representation in your sort of clinical evidence generation is probably important. I think one of the other things that that I think is really important is that there's been a lot of emphasis on just on training these data sets without really any sort of labeling requirement. And I think what that really the idea there is that you can train more easily when you're not doing any manual labeling. But I think with regards to optimizing for outcomes, you need to be able to train your models to know what good looks like. What does the good treatment regimen looks like? And there, having access to data, not just what's in the EHR, but also potentially claims data and outcomes data like mortality. Most EHR data does not have access, is not linked to mortality. So you could train an algorithm that is learning the patterns of use, but actually doesn't know which pattern is the one that is preferred. So I do think that is, to me, one of the risks is that based on the data that you use, based on the population that you study, and based on the training techniques that you develop, you basically create AI has been called an imitation machine, but which is great when you have a great thing to imitate. If you know what good practice looks like, if you know what good outcomes look like and what it takes to get good outcomes, then imitating that is great. But I think my concern would be when those considerations are not taken into place, and that can really affect, and that doesn't just increase bias, but it really degrades the performance of the entire model along many different vectors.
I think we have one more question that we had given. Yeah.
So thanks so much. My question is about the data. I mean, the data itself, right? I mean, do we need to have more emphasis on the tools, more regulations around the tools itself that go around the collection, the labeling, and the structuring of the data that are gathered and provided as an input to create these models? Or is this something that is a relevant question at this point in time?
Well, I think that's part of total product lifecycle management, right? Is kind of the planning and the design and the development of the data set, the integration, the testing, the validation. So that's kind of part of that TPLC model, right? That we use already for software as a medical device, and the same would be true for AI-enabled devices or Gen AI-enabled devices. So I think it kind of falls in that category. And I think the extent to which we evaluate that data and how we evaluate that data is what we're still trying to navigate as far as flexibility in the approach. What your thoughts are?
There are definitely some thoughts we have right now what we call clinical data research networks that are it's mostly EHR data that's shared across different orgs, but certainly certain standards around quality checks, et cetera. There has been talk over the years about having different ways that you would say grade the quality of your data. And we've mostly focused on clinical data, and there are many other sources that will be integrated more and more as we think about the whole person, or we think about integrating things like mobile health data, patient-reported data, et cetera. So there's huge opportunity there, and this is all being fed by data. So the more that we have as far as frameworks, regulation, et cetera, around that, that's incredibly helpful, or at least guidance about and transparency around that.
Well, thank you so much to our panel, and we are the last panel standing.